The bride covered her face in shame. He pulled her veil gently and said, "You're beautiful, Dakota Territory." Autumn of 1883. The wind clawed at the canvas tents on the edge of town, carrying with it the sting of ash and the whisper of rumors. In the dim lantern glow of Silver Creek's only saloon, men spoke in hushed tones, their voices scraping like boots on gravel. "They say she won't even lift her veil," murmured one ranch hand. "A bride hiding her face?" Another chuckled darkly. "What kind of secret does she carry?" Outside, the wooden church stood stark against the bleeding horizon, its bell silent but heavy with expectation. Inside, the air reeked of nervous sweat and oil lamps. A young bride knelt near the altar, veil trembling as though it shared her shame. Her hands, pale and clenched, refused to rise. Somewhere in the back pew, Elias Hart, the widowed rancher known for his cold silence, sat with arms crossed. He had not asked for this marriage. It was arranged, a desperate bargain between two families bound by loss. But when the vows fell silent and the world seemed to hold its breath, Elias stood, his boots echoing across the wooden floor. He reached for her trembling veil, gentle, deliberate, while the town outside whispered of scandal, secrets, and a love story no one believed could ever begin. Under a sky streaked with the pale gold of a waning autumn sun, the wooden church stood like a sentinel against the endless plains, its bell silent, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Dust swirled across the dirt road leading to its door, kicked up by wagons and restless boots as townsfolk filed inside, their voices hushed, their eyes sharp. Inside, the pews filled with bodies wrapped in Sunday coats, the air thick with the mingled scents of pine polish, candle wax, and the faint bitterness of sweat. Whispers rose like the buzzing of locusts, carrying suspicion from one lip to another, all centered on the trembling figure at the altar. Clara stood motionless, a white dress clinging stiffly to her frame, the veil drawn low over her face, hiding what she feared most. Her hands, small and pale, clutched the folds of her gown so tightly her knuckles whitened. Beneath the heavy lace, her breath came shallow, fogging the air in quick bursts. She felt the weight of every stare pressing against her back, each murmur slicing like a blade. They say she hides a scar. No bride keeps her face covered so long. A shameful thing, if you ask me. The words darted like daggers through the thick stillness, yet Clara did not lift her chin. She wanted only to disappear, to vanish into the floorboards, to let the world swallow her whole. At the far end of the aisle, Elias Hart stood rigid, a broad shadow carved in black wool. His jaw was set, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. A rancher by blood and habit, he bore himself with the unbending strength of a man who had weathered storms, droughts, and loss beyond measure. His first wife lay beneath the soil, his child beside her, leaving him a man hollowed out by grief. And now here he was, bound by arrangement to a stranger, a bride he had not chosen, in a ceremony that felt more bargain than blessing. The minister's voice droned, each vow heavy with ritual, but hollow with meaning. Elias answered with curt steadiness, his tone carrying the grit of the plains. Clara's voice wavered, breaking on the edges of her vows, trembling like glass held too tightly. She could not bring herself to look at him, nor at the curious faces gathered around them. When silence fell, heavy and expectant, all eyes turned to Elias. He stepped forward, his boots echoing sharply against the wooden floor, the sound cutting through the restless murmurs. The space between them shrank as he came to stand before her, towering, his presence both anchor and storm. Clara's breath caught as she felt the rough warmth of his calloused hand lift gently toward her veil. Every fiber of her body screamed to retreat, to clutch it tighter, to beg him not to look. But his hand did not rush, did not tear. Instead, with a patience that contradicted his hard reputation, he brushed the lace upward, revealing her face inch by inch. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Some leaned forward, others whispered, their voices sharp with judgment. Clara shut her eyes, her shame burning hotter than the midday sun. She waited for recoil, for disgust, for the look she feared most, that sharp flinch that cut deeper than any words. Instead, silence fell. Only the creak of the building and the soft hiss of the lanterns filled the air. When Clara finally dared to open her eyes, she found his gaze fixed upon her, not cruel, not mocking, but steady. His eyes, a storm gray touched with sorrow, lingered as though he were seeing not the scar upon her skin, but something beyond it. "You're beautiful," Elias said, the words low, unpolished, yet carrying a weight that silenced the room. The whispers died as though strangled, disbelief knotting the air. Clara's breath trembled, her lips parting but no words coming. For the first time, she felt the faintest crack in the wall of shame she had built around herself, a sliver of light slipping through. The minister cleared his throat, his voice faltering before continuing the final blessing. Rings were exchanged, his large, work-worn hand sliding a simple band over her trembling finger, hers slipping one onto his without daring to look up. The ceremony ended not with celebration but with a stunned hush, the crowd filing out with heads bent close together, gossip sparking like flint in the dark. Outside, the sky had deepened into rust and violet, the wind sharp, carrying the smell of rain. Clara walked beside Elias, her veil now pulled back, the chill biting her cheek, before slowly pulling it back, exposing herself to the dim light as though the shadows might still reject her. She expected him to look, to say something, anything, but he did not. He busied himself with firewood, striking a match, coaxing a small flame to life in the hearth. The fire crackled, its glow throwing flickers of gold across his features. Clara stepped closer, grateful for the warmth, though the distance between them remained vast. The silence stretched until she whispered, "It's colder than I imagined." Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the flames. "Winters here are worse." It was the first time he'd spoken since leaving the church, the words clipped, stripped bare of softness. Clara nodded, though her throat ached with unshed words. She carried her small satchel up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under her weight, and found a room prepared, bed neatly made, pitcher of water on the stand, curtains thin against the vast night beyond the glass. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap, the silence pressing so tightly it felt like it might choke her. That night, they shared supper at the long wooden table, its surface scarred by knives and time. A pot of beans, a loaf of coarse bread, and water drawn from the well. The fire crackled nearby, the only voice in the room. Clara reached for the bread, her sleeve brushing his hand. The contact jolted her, and she quickly pulled back, cheeks flushing. Elias did not react, only passed her the knife without a word. They ate in silence, each mouthful echoing in the hollow room. When her plate slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor, Clara gasped, kneeling quickly to retrieve it. Her hands shook, fumbling with the shards. Before she could cut herself, Elias knelt too, his large hand steadying hers. For a moment, their eyes met in the glow of the hearth. His gaze was steady, not cruel, not mocking. He simply held her hand, then released it, rising without comment. But something in that brief contact lingered, warming her more than the fire itself. As days bled into one another, their routines collided in silence. At dawn, he was already outside, the thud of an axe splitting wood carrying into her restless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee left cooling on the table, never brewed for two. She swept the floors, washed linens, and mended small tears, each task filling the emptiness with motion. Their paths crossed in the barn, her skirts brushing hay, his voice soft as he murmured to the horses. Still they spoke little. Yet every silence grew heavier, not with distance, but with something unspoken. Some tether neither could name. One evening, as wind howled around the eaves, Clara lingered by the window, watching Elias return from the fields. His shoulders were hunched, his steps weary. But when he entered, he paused briefly, as though surprised to see her waiting. He said nothing, only pulled out a chair for her at the table before sitting opposite. The gesture, small and wordless, struck deeper than any declaration. Clara lowered her gaze, a fragile warmth blooming in her chest. In the stillness of that house, carved from grief and shadow, the first cracks had begun to show, not of ruin, but of light pushing through. The storm came without warning, rolling across the prairie like a beast unchained. Its growl carried in the distance, long before the first strike of lightning split the horizon. The sky bruised purple and black, winds tearing at the earth, and the air thickened with the metallic taste of rain yet to fall. Elias had barely secured the last of the shutters when the heavens broke open. Sheets of water thrashing the land, rattling the ranch house until its timbers groaned in protest. Inside, Clara pressed a trembling hand against the windowpane, watching the storm consume the world. The prairie grass bent flat under the weight of wind. Trees twisted until they threatened to snap, and thunder cracked so close it rattled her bones. Her breath quickened, each strike of lightning flashing across her veil, casting shadows over the room like a phantom hand reaching for her. Elias lit a lantern, its flame shivering in the draught, painting the walls in restless gold. He set it on the table, then moved to check the doors once more, his movements calm, deliberate, as if storms were simply another chore to endure. Clara envied that steadiness, yet every gust made her flinch, her hands clutching her skirts. When a particularly violent clap shook the rafters, she gasped, pulling her veil tighter around her face as though it could shield her from more than shame. "Storm won't break the house," Elias said quietly. His voice roughened by wind and years, but steady. "She's held through worse." Clara nodded, though her lips refused sound. The lantern flickered, its glow fragile against the endless dark pressing in from outside. She sank into a chair, folding her arms across herself, rocking slightly as if to steady her own storm. Hours passed, the house trembling beneath nature's rage. Rain lashed against the windows like 1,000 fists. Wind howled through unseen cracks, and the fire in the hearth sputtered low. Elias added wood, coaxing it back to life, its warmth spilling across the room. He glanced toward Clara, her figure small, wrapped in shadow and lace. When she shifted, the veil caught against the chair's rough edge and slipped, falling just enough to bare the side of her face. Her hand shot up, frantic, fumbling to cover it, but the storm gave no mercy, wind rattling the glass, the lantern light catching her scar. She froze. Shame clamped her throat, heat rushing to her cheeks. She dared not meet his eyes, waiting for the recoil, the flinch, the whispered disgust she had learned to expect. Her breath came shallow, sharp, a bird trapped in her chest, but Elias did not turn away. He did not look startled or repelled. Instead, he crouched near the hearth, adding another log with slow precision, his movements unhurried. Only when the fire leapt brighter did he glance back, his gaze steady, unreadable yet absent of cruelty. Clara's hand shook as she tried to right the veil. Elias's voice broke through, low and even. "Leave it." Her fingers froze. The storm screamed around them, thunder splitting the sky, yet his tone cut through with quiet command, not harsh but weighted with something she could not name. Slowly, uncertainly, she let her hand fall. Elias rose, his shadow stretching long across the walls, and crossed the space between them. He knelt beside her chair, close enough that she could feel the... Elias sat near the hearth, silent sentinel. The storm mirrored in his eyes, but steadied by something new, something born in that night of wind and fear. And though the thunder still cracked, and the prairie bent under nature's wrath, for the first time since vows were spoken, the distance between them felt less like an endless plain and more like a narrow path waiting to be crossed. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie, pale and brittle, as Elias hitched the wagon for the long road into Silver Creek. Supplies had dwindled, flour nearly gone, coffee stretched thin, and Clara's needle worn to a nub from mending. She stood on the porch, veil drawn low, the hem of her dress brushing against her boots as the wind tugged at her skirts. When Elias glanced at her, she hesitated, her hands tightening in the fabric. She had not set foot in town since the wedding. She feared the stairs more than the rough road ahead. Still, she climbed into the wagon, her heart a hollow drum in her chest. The journey was quiet, hooves striking rhythm against the earth, wheels creaking in steady protest. The prairie stretched endless, but Clara's thoughts tightened like a noose. She imagined faces turning, whispers rising, cruel laughter curling from lips that once smiled politely. Beneath her veil, her scar seemed to burn hotter, as though the very sun sought to expose her. Elias drove in silence, his gaze on the horizon. Shoulders squared against the wind, Silver Creek greeted them with noise and dust. Wagons rattling, children darting between storefronts. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing down the street. As they stepped from the wagon, heads turned. A murmur ran through the crowd like a chill draft slipping beneath a door. Clara felt it instantly. The shift in air, the curious eyes, the lips that bent close to one another. There she is, the scarred bride. Poor man. Saddled with that. She keeps her face hid for good reason. The words slithered through the crowd, striking Clara sharper than any blade. She lowered her gaze, clutching the basket in her hands until her knuckles whitened. Shame pressed heavy, each whisper pressing her smaller, shrinking her until she wished the ground might open and swallow her whole. Inside the mercantile, the stairs followed. The scrape of boots behind her, the faint hiss of laughter, the clerk's lingering glance at her veil. Clara's hands fumbled with the coins, her breath unsteady. One jaw slipped from her grasp, shattering across the floor. The crash drew every eye, the silence that followed more deafening than thunder. Her cheeks burned beneath the veil, her chest tightening until she could not breathe. Then Elias's voice cut through. Low, firm, unyielding. Enough. The word carried more weight than the storm that once shook their house. Every head turned. Elias stood tall, broad shoulders filling the space, his eyes hard as flint. He looked at each face in turn, holding them until their smirks faltered. "She's my wife," he said, his tone steady as iron. "And you'll show her the respect due her name. Any man here got reason to speak against her, he'll answer to me." The silence cracked. Boots shuffled, eyes fell, whispers died mid-breath. Even the clerk bowed his head, fumbling to sweep up the shards. Clara stood frozen, her breath caught, the scarred skin beneath her veil prickling with heat, but not of shame. Something else stirred. Something she had never felt in this place before. Protection. Fierce and unyielding. Elias took the basket gently from her trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. "We're done here," he said simply, guiding her toward the door. Outside, the townsfolk stepped aside, their gazes softer now, their whispers hushed. The sky stretched wide above them, the air sharp with dust and pride. Clara walked beside Elias, her heart still quivering, yet steadied by the memory of his words echoing like a shield around her. When they reached the wagon, she dared a glance at him. His face was as stern as ever, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Yet she could not forget the way his voice had carried in that room. The way he had stood before her, not as a man burdened by duty, but as one who chose, in that moment, to defend her. As the wagon rolled out of town, Clara pressed her hands into her lap, the corners of her mouth trembling. Loyalty, fragile, uncertain, had been planted in her like a seed, small but alive, its roots reaching toward the steadiness she had glimpsed in him. The scar still burned. The whispers would never vanish entirely. But for the first time, she felt she did not stand alone. The road stretched long, the prairie wind sharp. But beside her sat a man who had silenced the world with nothing more than truth. And in the hollow of her chest, where shame once lived unchallenged, something warmer began to stir. The fire came rolling across the prairie like a beast born of the sun itself. Elias smelled it before he saw it. The acrid sting of smoke cutting through the late afternoon air, carried by the wind that never ceased its restless prowl. He strode out to the porch, scanning the horizon, and there it was, an orange glow crawling low and merciless, its hungry tongue licking the grasslands. Clara followed him, skirts clutched in her hands, her breath catching when she saw the distant flames swelling like a rising tide. "We'll lose the barn if it reaches the ridge," Elias said, already moving toward the shed for shovels and buckets. His voice was steady, but the hard line of his jaw betrayed urgency. Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled off her veil, tossed it inside, and gathered her skirts high enough to run. The prairie wind whipped her hair free as she caught up with him. They worked side by side, hauling water, beating back sparks with soaked burlap. The fire roared closer, a wall of heat that seared their skin and filled their lungs with smoke. Horses shrieked in panic, hooves hammering the earth as Elias calmed them with sharp commands, his voice raw against the storm of flame. Clara stumbled once, coughing, tears streaking her smoke-stained cheeks. But she forced herself forward, thrusting another bucket into his hands. Every gust threatened to undo their work. Every ember carried the promise of ruin, yet together, step for step, they fought the blaze. Her hands blistered, his shirt clung with sweat, both of them moving not as strangers, but as two souls bound by necessity, each trusting the other without a word. The fire raged, but at last the line held, the flames hissing against damp earth until, slowly, the beast's hunger relented. When the last smoke curled into the darkening sky, Elias collapsed against the fence, chest heaving, arms trembling from the strain. Clara dropped beside him, her breath ragged, dress smeared with soot, hair tangled and wild. For a long moment neither spoke. The prairie stretched quiet again, scarred but standing, the silence carrying not emptiness but survival. Later, inside the house, the hearth fire glowed, casting long shadows that danced across weary faces. Clara sat wrapped in a quilt, fingers raw, her body aching. Elias lowered himself heavily into the chair opposite, his eyes reflecting the flames. The silence between them was no longer the cold wall it had been. It pulsed with something unspoken, something waiting. Her voice broke it first, soft as the crackle of kindling. "I thought we'd lose everything." Elias's gaze lingered on the fire before turning to her. "I've lost more before." His tone carried no anger, only weight. The flicker of flames carved deep lines into his face, lines etched by grief more enduring than any storm. Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Your wife." "And child?" He nodded once, slow, as if the word itself cost him. "Maria, little Samuel. Fever took them both, one winter." He swallowed hard, his hand flexing against the armrest. "I buried them out past the cottonwoods. After that, the house stopped being a home. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the chimney." Clara's chest tightened, her own pain rising like smoke. She reached for words, found them tangled, but forced them free. "My scar, it wasn't born with me. A fire when I was a girl. The house caught, my brother saved me, but..." Her fingers brushed the ridged skin at her cheek, the memory raw even beneath years of silence. "He didn't come out. I've carried it ever since. The mark, the shame, the whispers." Elias's eyes softened, shadows shifting as though the firelight itself bent toward her confession. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "You survived. That's no shame." Her breath trembled, tears welling despite her will. "I've hidden it all these years. Thought no man would ever look at me without turning away." He held her gaze, unflinching. "I'm looking now." The words hung in the warm air, steady and certain. Clara's throat ached as the tears spilled, trailing down skin marked by flame yet kissed by light. Elias reached across the narrow space, his hand rough but careful as it brushed against hers. For a heartbeat, she froze. But then her fingers curled into his, the contact sparking warmth deeper than the hearth could give. The silence that followed was not emptiness but communion. Their griefs, once walls, now leaned together, making shelter. Elias's thumb traced the back of her hand, slow, hesitant, as though relearning what tenderness felt like. Clara leaned into the chair, the quilt slipping, her eyes reflecting firelight as her lips quivered with unspoken relief. "You're not alone anymore," Elias murmured, almost to the flames themselves, but Clara heard it. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle over her like balm, as healing as the warmth that wrapped them. The storm of fire had scarred the land, but here in the quiet glow of the hearth, they had found a different kind of flame, one that did not destroy, but promised to keep them through the night. The prairie had learned to breathe again, and so had the ranch. Spring rains soaked the fields, bringing shoots of green that whispered of renewal, and Clara moved among them with a lighter step than when she first arrived. Her laughter, once rare and fragile, began to echo faintly through the rooms, threading its way into the corners of the house that had long been hollow. Elias found himself listening for it, like a man listening for birdsong after a long winter, startled each time by the warmth it left in his chest. Work became rhythm, not burden. Clara's hands no longer trembled over the simple tasks. kneading dough, mending fences, brushing the horses. Elias would watch her sometimes, the morning sun catching on her loosened hair, and the silence that stretched between them was no longer heavy. It was companionable, filled with the presence of two lives gradually weaving together. When she smiled now, it reached her eyes, and Elias, against his own nature, found himself smiling back. Summer came, rolling heat across the plains, but the house no longer stood as a tomb. The kitchen grew alive with the scents of fresh bread and stews simmering long into the evening. Elias even laughed once, sudden and unguarded, when Clara tripped over a half-filled bucket and scolded the chickens as though they'd plotted against her. She froze at the sound, wide-eyed, then laughed too, the sound mingling with his until the rafters held joy again. By autumn, the harvest drew them closer still, their hands brushing as they gathered grain, their shoulders touching when they carried baskets in from the fields. The land flourished beneath their shared effort, and so did something unspoken between them, tender and steady as roots pushing deeper with every season. Elias no longer shied from her gaze, and Clara no longer lowered hers in shame. Their silences had turned into a language, a trust that grew wordless yet strong. When winter settled in, they faced it together, feeding cattle through snowdrifts, huddling near the hearth at night. Elias's grief was still there, like a scar upon his heart, but it no longer consumed him. Clara's veil gathered dust on its peg, worn less often now, forgotten on days when laughter filled the kitchen, or when Elias's steady hand brushed hers in quiet acknowledgement. Their wounds had not vanished, but they had learned to live with them, to make of them something that bound rather than divided. And so when spring returned once more, the ranch bloomed not only with grass and flowers, but with a gentler kind of life. Neighbors spoke less of the scarred bride, and more of the woman who carried herself with quiet strength, who smiled openly at the market, who stood by her husband's side without shrinking from whispers. Elias, too, found himself different, less a man of stone, more one who knew how to soften, how to let another in. One evening, as the sky spilled gold and rose across the prairie, Clara and Elias sat together on the porch. The day had been long, their bodies tired, but the air was sweet with lilac, the horizon lit as if heaven itself leaned close to watch. Clara leaned back against the rail, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of memory tugging at her, even in the beauty of the moment. She turned her face away, her voice low, barely carried by the evening breeze. "Don't look at me," she whispered, old habits tugging like shadows across her heart. Elias shifted beside her, slow and deliberate, and with a tenderness that had been carved from months of fire and storm, he reached. His fingers brushed the edge of her veil where it had slipped loosely across her shoulders. He lifted it, not with haste, but with reverence, drawing it back as though unveiling something sacred, something already known to him. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering in the hush of sunset. His voice was low, certain, carrying the weight of every season they had weathered, every silence they had filled, every wound they had tended together. "You're beautiful." Clara's breath caught, the words sinking deep, breaking the last fragile chain of shame. Her lips trembled, but this time they curved, slowly, into a smile that reached her eyes and glowed in the fading light. Elias's hand lingered against her cheek, rough and gentle all at once, and she leaned into the touch, her heart steady for the first time in years. The sky dimmed into twilight. The porch wrapped in the hush of evening, but the house behind them no longer held silence as a curse. It held it as peace, as promise, and in that tender quiet, born from ashes and scar, they sat together, two souls no longer broken but whole.